All right. So, welcome to this little intro to tea that is the subtitle of this one is The Thinking Brain. So, there are lots of ways that we could create an introduction to tea. There's lots of ways that I've taught it over the years. Some that start with like a map of the world, some that start with this whole explanation for what the tea plant is or how to brew it. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can get into this. I wanted to put this concept in conversation with the second part to this class, which is the feeling body, because often the way that we're presented with tea information in our environment is very scholarly, is very like hierarchical organized information that we need to know a lot up front first before we get started. And I started thinking about this more deeply because over the years as an educator, that is consistently one of the main barriers that I hear for people getting into tea is that there's so much to learn and that it seems complicated. I don't know if anybody here today like has ever felt that way when you first got into tea. Like there's a lot. There's a lot. And depending kind of on your own constitution, your own disposition, the idea that there's a lot to learn can feel exciting, right? It could feel like, oh, this is something that I could really grow with, right? I'm not going to get bored with, I think some of us really want something that we can stick with for a long time and not get bored with it. So admittedly, for some folks, it can be exciting. I think also, though, for quite a lot of folks, it's intimidating. It's intimidating, and then it becomes something that you sort of keep at an arm's length, like you're really not sure what the process is. And so I wanted a way that we can really be mindful of what it is we're learning and why. And it's something that I really like to question, the level of detail sometimes that we assume is needed to know to get started, or even needed to know at any given point, right? Everybody's knowledge level and how they're going to use it is very personal. It's very personal what you need to make a meaningful tea practice and, tea life, tea hobby, whatever you want to call it, for you. It's very personal. And a big part of that person is your person. It is you and your body and how you feel about it, right? It's not just what you're thinking about it, it's what you feel. And as we're going to explore in our second class, there are some really important reasons to bring that into consideration. So for this first session, we're going to go over some of the details of getting to know tea and hopefully start to make a little bit more connections as to, again, why we're learning, what we're learning, and where some of these things come from. So when we start with this concept of thinking brain, what does the thinking brain seek? And just some things that I thought of off the top of my head. I'm curious if there's some others that maybe you can think of too. Thinking brain, I think, prefers things that are in categories and compartments, right? So we like to organize our information. We like things to be in little boxes because we think that the box itself is a container that protects that information as solid, right? That's confirmed, it can't change, right? And organizing is just, how we start to map that out, right? So we need some organizing, we need some compartments. And when I make this list, I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong. It's just, it's worth observing. It's really worth observing when you kind of feel thinking brain clicking in as you are practicing with your tea and studying tea, just be aware what side of you is really speaking more loudly than the other. So thinking brain likes categories and compartments. Thinking brain also tends to like right or wrong answers. Something that can be, we've talked about this in some of our meditation classes here, maybe a little disappointing to learn. I don't mean to bum anybody out by this. It's just a neurobiological trait that we have as humans. We are actually hardwired for remembering negative more than positive. We are. It's not entirely a bad thing. It's what in evolutionary terms kept us safe. It's what helps us to remember, oh, don't eat these berries because you had a bad experience. You have to eat these berries, right? It's the experience of you had a wonderful, beautiful, just awesome day, and then somebody rudely cuts you off in traffic, and that one thing is the thing that you remember, right? We just are hardwired for negative. And so it takes effort, it takes really diligent effort for us to remember positive. And so when we think of how this applies to our learning, we tend to really like things in there concrete, right or wrong, yes, no, so that we can feel like we understand it. And therefore, things that are a little bit more complex or fuzzy can be hard for us to wrap our head around. Now, that's really worth noting because in tea specifically, there's a lot of fuzzy. I tend to really like fuzzy things. So I'll share it a little bit here. But, you know, learning to accept that not everything has a clear right or wrong, yes, no answer, that's kind of a big one for the thinking brain to wrap its head around, right? So when you encounter that in your tea learning, would you, even just something as like, you learn the steps for making this type of tea, and then you see that somebody else in a different country, from a different tradition, makes it differently, and it just kind of blows your mind. You're like, what? I thought it was this way, right? Be open to the fact that there's not always a right or wrong. And that brings us to our next one, specific steps to follow. People really enjoy the steps to doing the things. And so in situations where there's possibilities for multiple or agency or choice, and especially when you're kind of new and not even really sure what it is that you're experiencing, that can be really intimidating. So we tend to like logical order. This is the way that we're supposed to do things. And so it can be helpful then at the beginning of this journey to set things up where there is like that logical order that we're following, right? But it's, I like to think of it as like the training wheels for what's happening, right? So when you learn some of these things at first, like some of the steps we'll talk about for brewing our tea, for example, the ways we talk about how the tea categories are organized as another example. It's just like a little loose framework. Think of it like that. Like it's just a way to start to get closer and a little bit more comfortable with like the whole wide scope of it, because it's like being in a little terrarium kind of, and then you remove the glass walls of the terrarium and you're like, oh my god, now look at the whole world outside, and it's so huge, right? And there's so much possibility. And when you really start to see everything in tea, if you're not quite ready for that, it's a little bit like mind-blowing. So we start in the terrarium. We start by creating the little ecosystem. And so, yes, we present things as like there's some rules and there's some recommendations for such, but it's just to get you started. It's really, truly just to get you started, so that you can feel more comfortable exploring on your own. So keep these things in mind as we're talking. We'll, in the second class counterpart to this, we're going to explore things that the feeling body likes, right? And so that way, these two things in conversation with each other, you can then kind of think on when in the future you're taking tea classes or reading about tea or whatever, what part of your brain is being engaged or part of your body is being engaged, and bringing more awareness to the balance and the completeness of that experience, so that you can feel really comfortable with what you're learning. So let's start with a little bit of tea plant introduction with our tea plant friend. First thing I want to ask you, though, again, just kind of taking out of some context here, I'm curious if anybody would like to share, what other plants do you know the names of? I mean the names. They're botanical names. So I'm sure we know like types of trees and veggies and things like that, but what other plants do you know the names of off the top of your head? Does anybody know any plant names? Kind of a curious thing. I just realized this myself, like, seriously, a couple weeks ago. I don't think I really know that many plant names. So when I first started working in tea, I also was working in coffee. So I know coffee. Coffee is Coffea arabica, right? And I know tea. I don't, for as much of a plant person as I am, I don't think I know that many other plant names. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because sometimes we launch into this discussion of getting to know tea, and we really quickly just say the name of the tea plant and just kind of roll on by it as if everybody just casually knew the Latin name of so many other plants. So really just like spend some time with it. If it sounds like a funny name or a funny word, that's okay, because you probably don't know that many other plant names. So the name of the plant, it has two words. Its first name is camellia, and its last name is sinensis. 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 Camellia sinensis is the name of our tea plant friend. And let's go ahead and take a look at what our tea plant friend might look like when we are just traveling around and seeing some different examples of tea plant friends. So this is a fresh little tea shoot. This is the part of the tea plant that is picked for making tea. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment here. And so it may surprise you to learn that many of the world's best teas are harvested by hand. So much like other fruits and veggies and things like that we love, tea is also something that is very, very labor intensive, very handmade. And so it takes a lot of labor, a lot of work. And this is, I think, particularly astounding when we consider tea, because look at the tea in front of you in like your tray or your package, or you're waiting nearby your teapot. Every single one of those leaves was picked and handled and rolled and shaped with human hands. Like, it is a tremendous amount of effort that goes into producing tea. Now, our tea plant friend looks like it takes different forms depending on where it's growing. Sometimes we see it in like these little manicured gardens, like so, where it's growing in little rows, or in kind of like a bushy shape like this, right? So this is not all one plant. This is like a little rows, a little hedge, if you will, of tea plant. And then in other areas, it grows basically like a tree. So this is like a wild tea forest, so it's not kept in a kind of a farm type setting. And these can grow really tall when you don't trim it. Like the tea plant for most farm settings you can almost kind of think of it like training a bonsai or something like that, or some shrubbery in your yard, is like you shape it to be a certain way, a certain height. Like we saw the picture of the person picking tea. It comes to about their waist, right? Just makes it easier to harvest the tea. So, but when it grows wild, it's really enormous. So for some scale here of different types of farms and growing environments of tea, when you have just a fully tree form, it can be a couple stories tall. It can also just be about as tall as you, so, or as a person. So one of the photos there is it's about my height, it's not over my head, but I don't have to stoop down to get it. And then the picture at the bottom there, just kind of like a nice little hedge, this very typical kind of farm setting where they're planted close together, and they can even be like mowed, almost kind of like a little lawn, So it can take different forms in different environments. Now I'm curious, how many places does tea grow? How many countries do you know, or places where tea knows? Go ahead and name them in the chat if you know some places where tea comes from. You can get a sense for like how wide our understanding here of tea is. Yeah, so Sri Lanka is one. Hawaii, ooh, nice one. China, yes. India, Taiwan, Nepal, Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Anywhere else? Want to bust out a little globe here? Yep, Scotland. Get global. South Africa. Rooibos grows in South Africa. Yes, that's an herb. It's a different plant. Does tea grow in Africa? Does anybody know anywhere in Africa where tea grows? Yep, Kenya, Tanzania. Uh-huh. tea actually grows in a lot of places in Africa. It grows in Rwanda. It's like the whole central section. A lot of countries there grow tea. Same thing in South America, right? Does anybody know anywhere in South America where tea grows? This one's a little hard. I don't think as many people are aware of like tea growing in South America. Yep, Argentina. Yeah, that's a big one. Argentina's a really big one. Colombia. So, what do you think this says about the plant? What do you think this says about the plant itself, that it can grow in so many areas? Yeah, it's a hardy plant, it's a strong plant. What else do you think it would need in order to adapt to different areas? What do you think would make it so adaptable? Yeah, you can have some that grow with more or less water. So there's a lot of different varieties of the tea plant. You know, just like there's lots of varieties of people, there's lots of varieties of something like apples, right? You go to the farmer's market and maybe depending on where you live, where I live in the Midwest, it's apple country. So where we go, it's, you know, a dozen different types at the market, right? They're all apple, yes, but they all have names. They all look differently. They all taste differently. They all originated from different areas. And so tea is kind of the same way. Like you have the main plant, but we have these different varieties of that plant that are adapted to different environments, which is really cool. We'll take a closer look at some photos of the leaves so you can see how they, you know, themselves appear differently. For a little different sense of scale for the plant itself here, we have the Being Tea mascot here, Luff, our fuzzy buffalo, who appears in the Being Tea logo. Yes, everyone loves Luff. So here we have Luff in a giant tea tree, and then Luff buried in a little tea bush, right? So, you know, when you start to study what the tea plant looks like in different environments, it's really cool when you visit places like that, or when you see photos of them. Or I remember like one time a couple months ago just noticing, you know, those little rotating backgrounds that can pop up as a screensaver on your computer. At one point I recognized one of them was tea. You know, it's like this very picturesque scenic area with like, you know, kind of mountains and stuff like that. But when you notice, you can see the patterns for how tea is typically planted and what it looks like. And recognize, oh, that's tea. And I wondered actually if the people who made the background even knew that that was tea. So we start to recognize our plant friend when we see it in different areas. So let's take a little closer look at these leaves. So these are some freshly harvested tea leaves. These one actually came from another area that y'all named as an origin of tea, Mississippi in the United States. This is from a workshop that we did last month here at Being Tea with making fresh tea. So this is what the leaves look like when they are fresh, just picked. And so when we're harvesting leaves from the plant to make tea, it's a specific part of the plant we're picking. We're really picking like the new little baby leaves, you know. So like when we say buds for that are included in tea, buds we mean like leaf buds, not flower buds. And so some of them might be fully open, some of them are just a few days old. Now, in terms of just like economy of scale and productivity and everything that we're doing, why do you think that when you have a plant that is just absolutely full of leaves, why do you think you would only pick just the little baby leaves? Why wouldn't you pick more? Like the whole plant is full of leaves that you can make tea with. Why would you not just take more leaves? Taste can be part of it. Yeah, the baby leaves are going to have more flavor, right? They we don't want to disrupt the plant. you know. So let's think of this in another way. So as example, so if I have my little houseplant friend here that lives in the being tea space, okay, and we take a closer look at the leaves of houseplant friends. So quite a lot of them are larger leaves and they've been on here for quite a while. And then if we look really closely, we can see like little leaf buds, little teeny tiny baby leaves that haven't opened up yet, right? Now, if I want to shape my houseplant friend here at all, you probably have seen like gardening recommendations that would recommend don't cut more than like 20% of a plant at one time, right? What happens when we do that? It really doesn't like it. It's like, that's way too much. It's too big of a haircut, right? So just a little bit, right? So if I need to prune or shape this plant, I could just, take some of the little buds that are growing off of here, or the little new leaves. These older leaves that are on here, same thing as for the tea plant, they're for carrying out photosynthesis, right? This is like call this the maintenance growth on the plant. So it's an important part of our plant. We want to be able to leave that. Yeah, it helps it to be able to cycle through different growing seasons when we are very mindful of that. And so this is the same photo of these same leaves after a little bit of drying. And so something that we can consider what making tea is after we harvest these fresh leaves, that it's making tea is basically just like a creative way of drying out leaf. That's really as simple as it is. All the different styles of tea that you see are just creative ways of drying out leaf. So sometimes we could just let it air dry, sometimes we can roll it and age it, sometimes we could steam it, compress it, could ferment it, roast it in a hot pan. It's really just nearly limitless in things that you could do. But tea production, so we call those the steps of tea production. It's just basically a creative way of drying out leaf. That's really it. And I do like framing it that way because the more simply that we understand it, the less kind of mysterious this process seems. And so the steps then of someone making tea, if you see a tea producer making their tea, it's basically like a recipe. It's a recipe. And so just how one person's chocolate chip cookies might taste different than another person's, that's basically the same thing here with our tea. Now, I want to finish by just showing a couple close-ups of the leaves themselves so we can get a sense for the different varieties. So like this variety here, do you notice like wow, these are some big leaves. And they can get bigger. Like I've seen ones that are larger than my whole hand, right? So these varieties of the tea plant where the leaves are really large, they're very adapted to tropical climates. You think of just like tropical house plants that you might get. They have big, broad leaves. They're ideal for dispersing heat so that it doesn't, heat doesn't build up in the leaf. It could soak up the sunlight if it's growing as an understory. So you can have varieties of tea that look like this. This is a little bit more of a colder climate one. Do you notice how they even look thicker? Like they're kind of more crispy looking or dense, a little bit more rounded edges to them. They can have some color too. You can find ones that kind of have purplish color or different shades of green. Some have like a really pointy tip to them. Others are kind of more rounded. So you have to look closely to see some of the details of what, when you're looking at something and to be able to tell that that's tea that you're looking at. So largely like the structure of the leaf veins in particular, the shape of the leaf, things like that, general shape of the plant. And so let's apply this then and get to the brewing our tea. Yeah, let's take a look then at some of our leaves that we have in front of us and get a sense for what these look like after the tea has been made, right? So we're going to start first with our green tea and our white tea in our tasting. And so if you have your green tea open and putting that on a little tray, just seeing what you notice about these particular leaves. So compared to the fresh ones we saw, so we've seen it make like this quite a big transition from fresh leaf to now dry leaf. So what do you notice about these dry leaves? What kind of shape are they in? What kind of colors do you see? Get the fingertips in there. So one thing that's really noticeable is that these are really flat. These are very flat leaves. They're also very evenly green, this particular type. And you may have a different type of green tea at home. So notice just what shape yours is and how even or consistent it might be. Maybe bring the dish up to the nose and just smell the tea. And just notice what you smell, and you may not smell that much at this stage because tea, when it's dry, some types are very fragrant, but most are just kind of very lightly fragrant, right? So it takes a little bit of patience to warm up those leaves and get them to release a little bit of smell. So just kind of in and out, a few cycles. And see what's there. Oh, and if you haven't started your hot water already, go ahead and do that. For most green teas, we could say somewhere around 175 Fahrenheit or something like a little less than 80 C is probably fine. 78, 80 C is probably fine. It doesn't need to be a super specific temperature. We'll talk about temperature recommendations a little bit later, but let's keep it broad. We want to keep things loose. So with green tea, depending on the style that you have, does anybody feel like maybe they don't exactly recognize this tea compared to what we just saw in the photos? Like, is it kind of astounding to consider the difference of what they look like? Like, it looks so different. It really depends on the type of tea. Let's look at our white tea by comparison. Now, those of you who got the tea box, you got a little bit of the white tea cake, which is kind of cool. I specifically wanted to share that because I just think white tea cakes are so awesome. I have quite a few of them, different styles. You may also have just like a Bai Mudan, a white peony style, or silver needle. So the thing about white tea that's really lovely is you can really see the leaf, right? So you can recognize, hey, that photo that I saw of the plant, I could see that in my tea now. So that learning to recognize is an important part of making connection. So this is what the whole of that tea cake looked like before I start breaking it up for y'all. This is I tried to make it so that the surface is still nice and whole. So you see our leaves? Recognize our plant friend here? And so these ones have different shapes. They're kind of like a little bit of a slightly pointier edge to them. But it's very similar. It looks just like the ones that we saw in the photo. And so if you are unpacking this tea and maybe putting a little bit in a tray or something so you could look at it, just try to see if you can leave as many of the leaves whole as possible. White tea cakes, or tea cakes in general that are not like aged or fermented tea, is a little bit new. So if you haven't had one of these before, that's totally normal. They're a relatively new type of tea. So let's go ahead and measure out some tea. And we can measure for 2 teas at once. And while we're doing this, I'll share a little bit about brewing and how to measure our tea. For this, I'd recommend if you have a gram scale, that's helpful. And this is the reason why. We could see here on this slide really clearly some differences between leaf shapes, right? So these tea bags that are pictured here, they're the same size tea bag, but notice how the same amount of tea by weight in each bag takes up a different amount of room. This is what makes it really hard to just only rely on using a spoon and just kind of scooping the tea, because everything is such a different weight and shape and size, right? It just won't all nicely fit on a spoon. So, when it's available to you, using a gram scale is really helpful. And as far as measurement, we talked about this a little bit before we got our class started. But just a nice little golden rule, little magic measure. Honestly, I do not change this per tea. The only time I change this is if I'm using a gong fu technique. So bring in a gaiwan or in a small pot, which is more concentrated brew and a little bit different than we're talking about today. But for just kind of more westernized steeping, whether I'm working with a green tea or black tea or whatever origin, this is my default. I use this for basically everything. So 1.5 grams per 100 milliliters of water. That equals about 3 ounces for those of you who are working in ounces. And another way to phrase this, if you don't have a gram scale, if you are going to use a spoon, I recommend using a tablespoon because it's just a little easier to get the leaves on there, is a tablespoon per 8 ounces or 240 milliliters. So, if you know how much water your pot holds, it's going to make this process a lot easier. So go ahead and measure your tea based on this ratio if you can, or using a spoon. And it'll be the same for all of the teas. No matter what type you're working with, it's going to be the same measurement for all of them. And so we're just going to do the first 2 teas. So green tea. And, if you do have a bigger pot, you don't have to fill up the whole pot. So you could, make a smaller amount of tea. So say if you only want to brew 200 milliliters, you could just put 3 grams in there and save a little bit of tea for later if you'd like. Just kind of up to you. And we also don't have to drink everything that we're brewing here today, too. We could save some for later. If it's hot where you're at, you could even pop it in the fridge, have a little cold tea for later. And for our tea cake friend here, so I tried to make it so that everybody got like a nice little chunk, because I think that's just so cool to be able to work with like a whole little chunk of it. If you want, you can break it up a little bit beforehand. I'm going to use a couple loose leaves in here. And it's probably going to take quite a bit of tea because this is really lightweight tea. Now, if you are working with a whole cake, if you haven't worked with one of these before, I could show just a little briefly how we do this. You would need something like a little pu'er knife, so a specific little knife that is used for breaking up cakes. You could also use like a letter opener or even a butter knife, really. Like it's until you get, these are pretty easy to find from sites that sell pu'er tea. But the way that you get into a cake is you actually go in from the edge, so we don't stab it from the top. That's rude. We just kind of go in from the edge and just sort of work up a little loose piece here. Like so. This particular tea cake I was really interested to try. I hadn't had it before. This is one that's made in the winter. And it's made through a 10-month drying process, almost like in a greenhouse kind of environment. And so if you smell the leaves, the dry leaves, I'll admit when I first smelled this tea, it smelled very different to me. It smelled a little, like it's got like a little funk on there that you would expect of a fermented tea, like a pu'er tea. And I was just like, whoa. I mean, like the white tea cakes that I have don't smell that way, but when I tasted it, it tastes very much like a white tea, right? So it's just from that extended like kind of greenhouse style drying over a long time to develop this flavor. This particular winter white tea comes from the traditional homeland of white tea, which is Fujian province in China, which is on the eastern coast across from Taiwan. So I just thought it was really delightful. I thought this was a really fun tea. I was like, I'd like to share this one, so I hope you enjoy too. And once you have both your teas weighed out, so you may want to use slightly hotter water for the white tea. Often I see recommendations for brewing white tea that are way too cool. Just personally, I'll share a little bit more about like temperature and things like that, recommendations. But white tea, it's like these leaves are pretty durable. They're not, they can take a higher temperature and you tend to get more flavor out of them. So this means then for your first tea that we're brewing, our green tea, after you add the water, go ahead and kick up the kettle a little bit and bring it up to more something like around 185 or so, so around like 85°C. Just a little bit more. You get a bit more flavor. And green tea, as far as time goes, you could go with I often go with 2.5 minutes to get started if it's a tea that's unfamiliar with me and I haven't had it before. That's a nice, friendly little starting point. So you could just brew on your own time as you're ready and just keep time on your own tea. Now, if you're working with a Japanese green tea, try not to get into too many details in this first class here because it can get to be a lot. But I just want to recognize some folks may have a Japanese green tea. They tend to like a shorter steep time, so less than 2 minutes. I often go with like 1:15 or 1.5 for mine. But most other green teas, like this one that we have, really enjoy something that's a little bit longer, so like around 2.5 minutes. And just increasing the water temperature as you need. And then just observing your tea for a moment as it is brewing. Let's see what you notice. See what's happening here. So your tea may be kind of floating. Notice how some leaves may float to the top and some may be at the bottom. And some types of tea, traditionally speaking, we look for different things. So maybe the leaves kind of stand upright, all in a certain position, like they're all on their ends. Others kind of are at the bottom of the pot and slowly grow out like moss. That's one reason why I do enjoy working with glass for general tea brewing, is I really like to see what's happening. So it's a big part of the learning process, being able to see the whole of it. There's something that's really kind of quite magical about that. And so my water is still heating for my white tea, but my green tea is almost done steeping. So I'm going to pour it here in a minute. And again, just, moving your own pace, however you're going. No need to rush. We've got plenty of time. This particular green tea that we are using for this class is, I picked this one up because I thought there's a few points about it that are really interesting for discussion in terms of quality of tea and understanding the seasonality of tea. So I'll bring out the leaves here again so you can take a little closer look. When yours is done steeping, if you want to go ahead and either take out the infuser basket or open the lid and smell the leaves that are inside. So when we are evaluating tea, the smell that's on the steeped leaf, this is the most fragrant part of the tea. So you'll notice it might smell quite a bit different than it did when it's dry. So you really just kind of stick your nose inside the pot. And same as we did with the little tray of the dry leaf, really stay with it. Really just breathe the tea. So this is a really nice, very fresh tea. So this is from this year. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about it, so this tea doesn't really have a name. You may notice that if you got our tea box for this class, that some of the teas don't really have a name. They're just more described by where they're from or what type they are. That's very normal. Not all tea has a traditional name or any kind of lineage with it. It's just a tea that someone made. So you could kind of call it whatever you wanted. As far as if you were selling the tea, you could make up a name for it. You can name after the village it came from, for example. This particular tea, the seller called it book cover, as a way of saying not judging something by its cover. So if we look really closely at the dry leaves, like a little bit more closely than we did before, we might notice that there's some inconsistent sizes. Not super, like it doesn't look choppy or messy or anything like that, but there are some different sizes, different pieces. You might notice an errant stem here or there, or a little piece of a stalk or something. So, and you might see this actually a little bit even more detail if you look at the infused leaf. So look at the leaves inside your pot and just see what you notice. See what's there. You might even notice, like, I got a little brown leaf, right? Normally in green leaf or green tea, we just want only green leaf. So I got a little brown leaf here. So with tea from this particular area, so this one comes from China, from Sichuan province, and this was made at the peak spring season, pre-Qingming, so before the rainy season, right? And the teas that are made at that time are some of the most valuable of the whole year, right? Because when the rains come through the gardens, there's a period where the plants need a little bit of time to adjust, right? The rain literally can kind of dilute some of the flavor, right? The leaves in the plants are full of water. So the first picking of the year that comes at the very beginning of the harvest season, right after the winter sleepy time, the plants wake up, and the teas that are made in that period before the springtime rains, those are some of the most valuable teas of the year. And it's honestly when a lot of farmers make the most of their money. And so some of those teas can be very, very expensive. If you ever go shopping for springtime green teas from China, they are spending. And so this tea, I really appreciated the seeking out of this type of tea, because what this one is actually, it's made during that time, but what the producers will do is they will sort out by hand, like any just like little, like a broken leaf here or there, anything that might make it just a little less than perfect, and the leaves that are at the perfection, that's what gets them their, like really top dollar, right? But then you have like the little leftover ones, right? And in the spirit of like not wasting anything, right? Like it's still like precious leaf from the very best tasty season, right? So still selling that, like creating that and putting that together and selling that. So I really love that. It's one of the first times I've ever seen something like that from China. It's something that is it's a concept that I see a lot more in Japan and in Taiwan, honestly, of making sure that all parts of the plant that are harvested are put to good use. Like in Taiwan, for example, you may notice like Taiwanese oolongs, which we have a nice little ball rolled example of an oolong coming up. Often they don't have a whole lot of stems on them. In Taiwan, they'll pick off the stem just because aesthetically it doesn't look as nice, but they'll save the stem and then brew that for tea. It's just like tasty local economical tea, right? It's lovely. I think that's so cool. So I really appreciated finding this tea because it's such a nice conversation piece. I'm going to go ahead and start my white tea while we're chatting here. It's important to note that like not all tea needs to be expensive. Not all tea needs to come from a certain pedigree or history or farm or lineage or anything like that in order to be special, in order to be worthy, in order to taste good. So I really wanted to bring that up as something like, look for teas like that. Look for teas that don't have a name. Look for the ones that are odd, that come from a place you haven't heard of, that are from a variety you haven't heard of. Just try it, because there's so much good tea to be had out there, and not all of it needs to be something where it's $50 for a little package of it or something, So if you have your green tea ready, let's go ahead and taste it. And also if you have the hot water for your white tea, you can go ahead and start that brewing. The white tea I would leave in for like a good 3 or 4 minutes. White tea really likes to soak. You may notice like it's really going to just kind of keep being super fluffy. It's going to float. So it's a nice one. Just let it soak. Let's go ahead and taste our green tea, whatever type that we have. And when we taste green tea, when we're trying to, or tea in general, when we're kind of looking more to evaluate the tea, we tend to slurp it, make it pretty loud. And you could slurp it as loudly as you want or feel comfortable with it in your own home as you like. But the slurping helps us to be able to take in air so that we can taste and smell at the same time. And that really helps to open up everything that's happening inside the nasal cavity and the throat. So we're really tasting the full capacity. So try slurping, even if it feels a little funny or weird or people are looking at you in your home. It's okay. They're missing out. And as you're tasting your green tea, what are you noticing? What sort of sensations or tastes are coming to mind? And don't make it about like tasting notes. It doesn't have to be super analytical or anything like that. Like just like what sensations are you getting? What is it? What is your tea like? Nice. Yeah, I like so much sharing it. It tastes really good when brewed at the proper temperature. Yeah, like it's we have recommendations for a reason. And so this is the balance. This is the balance we're going to keep exploring in our next class. Like we want to get to a place where we feel we know something well enough that we could take the training wheels off and we could play a little bit more. However, we also want to understand what we're doing, right? So that we have a result that tastes good, right? So I find it's really common to meet folks who don't enjoy green tea, honestly, no matter what type you give them. At first, because most of their ways that they've ever had it has been brewed wrong. It's been really hot water or steeped too long or whatever. And, if that's your only experience you've ever had with it, it could taste really bitter. It tastes really medicinal. If you get like an excessive sort of like dry cotton mouth kind of quality, so that drying is called astringency in tea. And to a certain extent, all tea is going to have that. It's going to have a little bit of astringency. It's going to have some bitterness. It's kind of the nature of it. You can't, if you have it without it, it would be like, you know, a fizzy drink that has no more fizz, right? It's just, ugh. So you need some of it to have texture, but it shouldn't be overwhelming. And so when the brewing is off, it gets overwhelming, and it's hard at first to know, is that the tea or is that me or like what's going on here? So yeah, when you have like some little parameter to play with, it's really helpful. And one person's sharing here about the importance of having a kettle that sets the temperature for you. Yeah, that's really helpful because until you get a sense for what different water temperatures feel like, sound like while they're heating, even, what they feel like to touch or what they, feel like on the tongue, it's really hard to just guess. It's super hard to guess. So if you don't have a kettle that sets temperature, you can even just use a thermometer. Honestly, stick a thermometer in the spout or in the lid and just I did that for like a decade before I got a kettle that could adjust temperature. You can really adapt to anything that seems sort of odd at first or maybe overly complicated, like using a scale. To me, using a scale is no more complicated than scooping it, because all I do is it just sits in my little tea spot over there. I put teapot on it, measure the tea in, use my fingertips, right? It's not hard. I use the same size teapots like in gaiwans, so I just know, okay, this gaiwan 5 grams, this teapot 6. It's just repetition. It's not hard. It makes things a lot more consistent, and especially in the beginning when we were just learning, giving yourself that consistency is helpful. It's really helpful because you just don't know why things are kind of all over the place at first. Mm-hmm. Just keeping an eye. I think my white tea should be about done. So if your white tea is about done, go ahead and pour your white tea and still save your green tea. We're going to kind of compare these two side by side. And when your white tea is done steeping, first thing you want to do is get in that pot, smell that leaf. And you may notice, especially if you are working with one of the teas that we had in for the kit here, that it smells really quite differently once you brew it. Oh my gosh. It's so so white tea often has like this kind of spicy, fruity, flowery, like cooked jam sort of quality. It's so yummy. So the reason why we're starting with green tea and then we kind of progress to white tea, green tea is like all tea is, it's a spectrum and it's a circle and it's a cycle. You know, so tea, one of the things that's kind of hard to wrap our heads around at first is that it doesn't actually go in these little sort of buckets where it's only defined by a certain thing. They actually overlap quite a bit. The more you learn about tea, you see there's a lot of overlap. So green tea, at the very beginning, green tea is like closest to what it would be like when it's on the plant, like when it's on the bush. It's what's called an unoxidized tea, unoxidized. And so if you, when you're looking at some of your leaves, if you did see some that had, I'm just gonna make some mess here. If you saw some that had like a little bit of brown to them or yellow, that's oxidation. Let me see if I can find one. Oh, found one. Lucky me. Thank you for being such a good student, tea leaf. Okay, so like this one's got a little bit of like reddish browning around the edge to it. So that is oxidation. It's basically like when an avocado gets a little bruise on it or an apple or something. And so all other tea is defined partially by how much oxidation it has. Like this little bruise, just like it makes an avocado or an apple taste differently, it makes the tea taste different. Fortunately for tea, it happens to be a tasty difference, unlike for an avocado, which is just stupid when it gets oxidized. Tea is actually really quite nice. So that fruity, floral, spicy, whatever yumminess you might be getting from your white tea, it's because of this. It's because of oxidation. And the lack of it, the rest of this tea that's all like lovely and green and such, that green vegetal quality, that is because it is unoxidized. It doesn't have any bruising or anything like that to it. So that's what makes green tea taste very vegetable-y, very grassy, very just green. And I will say, I got leaves all over me. It might seem like it's a little hard to describe green tea because of that. I don't know about you, but does anybody else have like, it feels maybe like your words might be a little bit more bound or limited to describe the green tea, like vegetal, okay, and then maybe some specific veggies like spinach or broccoli or whatever, but it's all kind of flavors of green, and you might think like, gosh, why can't I say more things about it? Green flavors are actually, chemically speaking, just very simple. There's just not a whole lot. It doesn't mean that they're not terribly yummy. I drink a lot of green tea. Green tea is like one of my favorites. Particularly Japanese greens. I'm drinking them all the time. So I really enjoy it. I also recognize the vocabulary for it is kind of very specific. When we get into oxidized teas, such as our white tea, and we can see this on some of these leaves here too, in, you know, whatever kind of white tea that you might be working with. Oxidation. And we can see just different color development. We can even see it inside, or I'm sorry, in the brewed tea as well. Do you notice it's like a different color? It's sort of like a more golden tone to it. So you see that coming through in the brew as well. So that is really, that's a big part of what you're smelling and tasting, is the first stage of oxidation. And so we're going to find echoes of that coming through in the other teas, and basically any other tea that you taste is that kind of like level of that. So that's a key difference to understand between green tea and other types of tea. Does anybody so far have a preference between one or the other, like the green tea or the white tea? And it's okay to acknowledge preference too. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's the, process of acknowledging what your own needs are, what's coming through for you today, what is not really coming through for you. What are some things maybe that you just need more time with? There's definitely teas that some of us just need more time to experiment with and kind of get a sense for. But yeah, they're really, really different. They're super different. So we can go ahead and, no rush, but transition to brewing the other two teas. If you like, save the first two, like maybe put them in a little mug or something, keep sipping on them for later. You don't have to toss them or anything. but just, making any like cleanup that we need to do to get ready for the other ones. And I want to share a little bit more about some brewing in terms of temperature recommendations, because I know that that's like a big thing to kind of just know what the possibilities are. So I'll put up here on the screen um, another little chart here, and you can make notes as you like. So these are just general recommendations by category. Here's what we've been playing with, and we're going to continue to play with. So notice we have green teas in two different categories. This is because this first one, steamed green teas, this is largely teas from Japan primarily that are steamed like this, and steaming tends to make them a little bit more fragile, a little bit more sensitive to brewing temperature and such. So they need a little bit of a cooler water typically. Pan-fired greens, like we just had, the one from Sichuan, pan-fired means that they're just roasted. That's how they keep instead of being steamed, they're roasted, and that's why they stay nice and fresh and green. They're a little bit more temperature resilient. They're hardy teas, so they can take a little higher temperature. And notice that the other ones, we have white and oolong together, black and dark teas, which basically just means fermented tea. So there's kind of a whole range of tea listed here. You don't need to get super, super specific adjusting the temperature for every single tea. Honestly, if you have the ability to just really primarily mind one temperature, I would say green tea is the most important. That's the one where you're really going to notice. Those of you who've ever had a negative experience from drinking green tea, it probably was from the water being too hot, or the next thing we'll talk about, the steep time being too long. Other teas are much, much more resilient. So you don't have to, if this seems really complicated to adjust your water temperature for all of these teas, just don't do it. Like especially if you are primarily interested in practicing tea for just mindfulness or just personal enjoyment in that way. When we work with bowl tea, for example, in Quiet Tea Sundays and a lot of the other tea meditation classes I teach, you just need the water hot. Most of the time I'm working with something that's like between 175 and 185. So I'm really working that like around 80 to 82 C. I don't really adjust it by anything else other than that. Maybe a little bit hotter if I'm working with super dark tea or something that's roasted that really needs hot water to open it up, or it's the winter time here in Chicago where I am, and it's really cold. So I need something that's hotter. You don't really need to adjust it quite this way. But if you are ready to learn a little bit more, play a little bit more, you have the ability to adjust the water temperature, then this is how you could do it. This is one way that you could do it, and just see what that's like. And of course they're recommendations. You're going to find teas that are outside of this little spectrum. And then the next one we want to talk about is water temperature, is steep time. So here's some recommendations for steeping time. And again, this is for Western style brewing. If you are using gongfu ware, gaiwan, or a small pot, different topic of how to brew in that way. Usually the main recommendation difference is just that the times are a lot shorter. It's like seconds instead of minutes. But for most of the time, if you're just making yourself a mug or a pot of tea, it's, something like this. Again, here, notice Japanese greens are called out separately, anywhere 45 seconds to 2 minutes. They're just much more sensitive. They brew really quickly. Most of the green teas, I often start with 2.5 is a nice little, if I don't know a green tea, it's the first one I've ever had from someone or whatever. 2.5 minutes is kind of my go-to. So somewhere 2 to 3 for most green teas. And then notice everything else is like 3 to 5 minutes. Like, it's super, you really, it doesn't need to be super complicated. You will find the sweet spot that works for you as you play a little bit more, right? You will start to notice, I like my white teas at 4 minutes, or I like this particular black tea at this, 5 minutes or whatever. But this is, I made the comparison earlier as to like training wheels. This is just to get you started. It's just so that when you get a new tea, pick up a new tea from somewhere, you have some way of figuring out what to do with it. And that's ultimately really what we want here. All of, like, a big takeaway for an intro tea class should be knowing how to brew your tea. Like, all the other stuff, like learning more about where the tea comes from and the names of tea and different ways that they're produced and everything like that. This whole, I mean, there are, in the green tea category alone, for example, there are thousands of types of tea. You actually may be surprised to learn that green tea is the biggest category of tea. Not many people realize that. Green tea is, seriously, it's thousands of types of tea. Right, so you just cannot learn all of it in one lifetime. Right, so try not to spend too much on the areas of tea learning that are lists and compartments and things like that, and steps and procedures. The brewing part that's how you're going to get to a point where you can start to learn a little bit more on your own and teaching yourself and experimenting, right? So the brewing, learning how to brew and feel comfortable with those steps, how to measure it, how to adjust your water temperature, some understanding for time, really helps to open things up more for the process. So let's go ahead and get set up, start measuring for our other two teas. Again, the gram weight will be the same. So whatever, if you're using the same, teapot that you had before, it'll be the same. So we have our Vietnam oolong, and we have our black tea Kuan Yin, which is a really special tea. I'm very excited to share this one with y'all. And so we'll start with the oolong first. And again, for both of these, you probably want a little bit hotter temperature. So somewhere around, 195 or 90 C. Same gram weight for both. Nice and simple. Notice I'm using my fingertips for these. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our next session, but yeah, being able to touch your tea and get up close to it, this is a big part of the learning. So partially why I really love working with gram scales so much is because you actually just get to touch the tea. I would much rather take the slight complication of working with a gram scale versus using a spoon where I'm just kind of like stabbing at the tea and digging around in it. Like, I would rather use a scale and just be able to like get in there and just scoop. Use your fingertips. It's so much better. And setting aside your tea, if you have from the first round, whatever you need. And so our next two that we have are oolong and our black tea. So this is going to get a lot more into oxidation. So this step that we described earlier, a really definitive step for the differences between types of tea. We shared that green tea, being an unoxidized tea, is generally very light, very vegetal, and with white tea we really start to taste the first layers and impact of the oxidation step in tea. So that gets a lot more dialed up when we get into black tea and into oolong. And as such, when we are tasting these teas, you may notice your vocabulary might be quite different. There's just chemically, there's more happening with these teas. So you may have more words literally that you can say about these teas versus like a green tea, which can be really quite simple, very straightforward. Whenever you're ready with your water, we can go ahead and brew these teas. And the water temperature can be the same for both of them. So you could brew, if you have the ability to, you could brew both of them at the same time. And both of them would probably really like a nice long little steep. So I would say somewhere around 4 minutes. Now, one thing we haven't really talked about very much yet is re-steeping your tea, re-infusing it. So any tea, regardless of the brewing method that you're using, you can definitely reuse these leaves. So something to just keep in mind as we're going, through all these teas over the course of the weekend and such, is you could save the infused leaf. I would say try to use your re-steeps within 12 hours. You don't want to keep them for like days at a time or anything like that. But if you wanted to have more of a tea later, you could certainly like take the little scoop of the leaves and put it in a tray, put it in a little dish or something like that, set it aside, have it again later. Most teas are good for at least a few infusions, so adding just fresh water to it, re-steeping it. It's something we often do in tea meditation classes because it's, getting that second look at the tea, getting, fresh water in there to help open it up and bring new things to the surface really can help more deeply inform our understanding of that tea and understanding of our own experience as well, rather than, tasting it just like one time and then moving on to the next thing. Tea's really, the intention of it is to reinfuse it, is to enjoy it for several steepings. That's really what the purpose is. And it's unique in that that's really the only thing I think that we have that is like that. Everything else, like coffee grounds, we don't rebrew coffee grounds, right? So many other things we have are just enjoy it once, move on to the next thing. So it's a little bit different. And sometimes if folks don't have a practice yet of re-steeping their tea, they're like, that's weird. Like, why would I do that? But try it. See what you notice about your teas. And these, while they are steeping, let's take a look at what's happening here. Look at our little oolong. So I wanted to choose this style of oolong to show you all. This is a ball rolled oolong, named quite literally for the shape of it. It's just leaves that are rolled up into a little ball. And this type of tea really is kind of magical to watch while it's brewing because it just slowly unfurls and opens up. And you'll just notice how really big the leaves get, how much room they take up. So this is an important part of understanding tea brewing and the type of tea ware that we choose, is seeing how much room the leaves take up. Sometimes when we're starting out with this journey of exploring our tea, maybe we're just using some equipment or something like that's laying around the house. We have those like little tea balls, that like you put in the big giant English style teapot or something. And I guess like for the economics of it, if you're using a little small broken grade leaf or something, kind of like grocery store tea, that's okay. But for when you're working with it's just whole leaf. It's really big, right? Tea needs room. Tea needs lots of room. And nothing demonstrates that more than an oolong tea. The more room that it has to stretch out and to breathe and to get comfortable, it's going to yield more flavor, right? So look for ways that you can brew that are as really expansive and spacious as possible. Little baskets, for example, that fit inside a mug or a pot. You can find ones that are almost as big as the inside diameter of the mug itself too. Don't get ones that are like really narrow and cylindrical. Get something that's nice and big. They can really let that tea fluff out. And that's also another way to really help improve flavor for your tea. And same thing as with our first two teas. Once we are done steeping these, the very first thing we're going to do is get inside that pot, smell that leaf, see what it is we're noticing. We might notice some things that are similar to the first two teas. It's kind of like this continuing through line, which makes sense. It's the same leaf. They may come from different origins in different countries, but there's something similar about it on a very basic level because it's the same plant. So that's kind of a cool thing, when you start to notice that. And that's what, makes the experience of drinking tea so different than drinking herbal teas, because they come from just so many different plants, right? There's not a through line there from one to the next. You drink a chamomile and then you drink a rooibos, and they're totally different. Tea all has kind of a similar base note continuance through it. Just smelling each one, see what you notice. Our oolong, for example, might smell a bit similar to our white tea. See if you notice what ways is the oolong different from the white tea, though. If it's different at all for you. What do you notice? For me, I notice there's like a certain kind of a depth to it. The white tea tends to be very like kind of sweet and a little bit more upper body, you know. And oolong tea starts to really like I smell it and almost I really feel it in my belly. Like it's more grounding smelling, and it tends to have like this really interesting combination of fruity and floral, but also some vegetables, some earthy notes. Like somebody's noting chard, you know, like yeah, like we could smell veggies in it, as well as like perfuminess. Um, some roastiness. Yeah, I really like that. Like oolong, a finishing step for almost all oolongs is to roast it a little bit. So we smell sometimes this kind of like nice baked or roasty aroma with our oolongs. And that's not a step that we use in white teas. So oolong can be a very layered experience, which I think that's why people tend to gravitate towards that category. It's so expansive. There's so many possibilities there. Oolong basically is everything that is like between white tea and black tea. Like it is a big category in terms of its flavor variety. It's not as in terms of numerous variations of it in style. It's not as big as green tea, but you know the experience of what you have of oolong is really dynamic. There's truly, I think, an oolong for everybody. This is on the lighter end of the scale. This is what we would call like a greener style oolong. So it is similar to a white tea, but they can get really, really deep from here. By contrast, this black tea that we have, if we want to dive on into our black tea, and just see what you notice with the black tea. This black tea I really wanted to share with you. There are some other types that are similar to this where the leaf, the variety of the plant, remember we shared that there's different varieties of the tea plant. Some are favored for making certain types of tea versus others. Very similar again to apples. Like the idea of some apples are better for baking with and some are better for just eating fresh. Could you take the fresh one, you know, the one that's ideal for just munching on and make a pie with it? Sure. It may not turn out exactly the way you like, but you could do it, right? So this black tea is made with a variety of the tea plant that is normally used for making oolong. Those of you who are fans of tea Kuan Yin oolong, I saw like somebody here today is drinking a tea Kuan Yin oolong. Recognize that name. It's one of the most famous varieties of oolong. So in this case, the tea maker decided to make it into a black tea. That's very cool. And you do find that. It's like when you're reading details for teas, when you're shopping for tea online, look for little nuggets like that. That's really cool. This is this crossover of oolong varieties, the plant being used to produce black tea, are becoming more common. I think it's really neat, and it's something that creates a lot of interesting experience for folks to share. You know, kind of breaking us out of this idea of thinking oolong is just oolong, black tea is just black tea, etc. They're all very related to each other. So when you feel ready to taste, go ahead and taste each one. And one thing that we might notice right away with oolongs that is a really different experience compared to green tea is the texture. So how would you describe the texture difference? Like, what does this oolong feel like on the tongue compared to the green tea? Silky. Ooh, yeah, that's a really good word. Yeah. Like they have this kind of like softer, yeah, pillowy, buttery sometimes kind of sensation. Whereas green tea is very crisp. It feels very like a little bit dry, kind of got that fresh veggie crunch to it almost. And oolongs are super smooth and melty. So if you really like that kind of texture, oolongs are probably going to be your jam. Most of them are very much like this. They're very, very smooth teas. Interestingly, too, they often happen to be really helpful teas to have in the evening because they're naturally very lower in caffeine. And the reason why, if we dig into our teapot here and we take a look at the leaves that we've used to make this tea, oolong leaves tend to be really large. These are the older leaves on the plant. They're not like the very base foundation leaves, but they're, they're from the same season, but just a little bit older than the buds. They're older leaves. And so the older leaves are naturally going to have less caffeine in them. The caffeine is primarily concentrated in the little leaf buds because that is what helps protect the plant from insect invasion, like the caffeine tastes bitter to bugs. So the teeny tiny little baby leaves tend to have more caffeine. So teas that are made from those have more caffeine, like white teas, green teas, anything that's really small like that. Versus the older leaves, which it's largely oolong that's made from that. Oolong is made from the older leaves. And so they're lower caffeine. They tend to be really nice evening, relaxing, winding down teas like that. And then what do you notice about our black tea friend here? Which, when we have these types that are made from the same variety as an oolong, you may notice similarity to the oolong. And this is where things get interesting because sometimes it can be difficult to tell, is this a black tea or is this an oolong, right? The line there is a little fuzzy. It's a little fuzzy. They have similar steps in terms of how they're made, similar recipes. We called that earlier. Very similar. Black teas tend to be what's described as fully oxidized. So when we look at our black tea leaves, they are totally reddish and brown. Very, very consistent reddish brown colors. You may notice like a little bit of an olive tone depending on some of the teas, depending on where they're from. Like if you happen to be enjoying a black tea from the Himalayas, so from Darjeeling or Nepal, you might notice a little bit more of a olivey color, but for the most part, they're very reddish and brown. They're fully oxidized, and so they have this more. I'm seeing somebody use the word pungent in the chat room. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, black teas are very they're spicy, they're pungent, they're bold. They can be smooth. This one I find is a particularly very smooth black tea, but it's definitely got a lot more to it. It's really interesting. And definitely much more lower body, right? So we may have noticed like the green and the white teas are kind of higher, a little bit more like chest, throat, head area, and the oolong and especially this black tea, we're really feeling it lower body, right? So just observe where you are feeling these teas, what you notice about that, how do you feel about it? Because that's going to be something that we're going to continue in our next class around how we feel in the body when we're drinking our tea. And consider that some teas may seem you're drawn to them more some times of year than the others, right? So if it is summertime where you are practicing with us, something like a spicy, cocoa-y kind of black tea might seem kind of odd, like you want something that's cooler and lighter and sweeter. If it's wintertime where you're practicing, though, that may be really perfect for you right now. So it's an interesting observation that teas not only have such different flavors, but different effect on us. Ooh, it's so cool. So I'm going to go ahead and pause right there because this could just kind of like roll on into the next section. Okay. We're going to get ready to take a break in a moment here. What I want you to consider as we're taking our break, really just like giving yourself a moment to just soak in everything we've covered because it's been a lot. Learning about tea in the beginning is kind of like, whoa, there's a lot. It's exciting. It's very buzzy. Ask yourself, what do you feel like you know now? What do you feel like you understand now? And what do you feel like you still don't know or you still don't understand just yet? Be open to some things may not have answers, some things may, and we'll talk about them a little bit more. Just ask yourself, what do you feel like you know? What do you feel like, okay, I got a good handle on that? And what do you feel like you don't know? And we will go ahead and pause right there.